So thank you guys all for showing up for our Earth Week lecture. Tonight's lecture is going to be on Delaware's Wildlife Action Plan, and we're going to be joined by Sam Robinson, who is in charge of this plan and talking all about the importance of this. And it's essentially the background and game plan for helping us best conserve and protect many of our endangered and threatened species that we see here in Delaware. So for anyone who's watching online, please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat, and we'll answer those at the end of the program. For those of you here, feel free to ask away. If you do need to use the bathroom, they're located right behind that wall over there. Other than that, I'm going to let Sam get things going, and we'll get her presentation up and running. Cool. And thank you guys for joining us. And well, thank you. Let me move that for you. Not that it would be annoying. All right.
Thanks, Patrick.
No problem.
So today's not quite Earth Day. It's Earth Day-ish, right? It's the day after Earth Day. But yeah, thanks everyone for coming to hear me talk about the Wildlife Action Plan for a little bit. So, not changing there.
Sorry, it's done this before.
Good.
It's all right. Technical difficulties.
Yay, that's me.
There we go.
So my name's Sam. I'm not Anthony, so sorry. But he delegated this presentation to me. So I am the state's Wildlife Action Plan Coordinator. I've been with DNREC since 2020, although I had a little bit of a gap in there. And I've been involved with this revision process since I started. So states have been gearing up for this revision since really the last plans were due in 2015. So today, just briefly, I'm going to go over a primer of what wildlife action plans are, go into the history of Delaware's Wildlife Action Plan. I'm going to spend the meat of the talk talking about what the Division of Fish and Wildlife does that's guided by our Wildlife Action Plan, and then talk briefly about the current revision process and where we are. So wildlife action plans are colloquially known as the blueprints for conserving our nation's fish and wildlife. Also known for keeping common species common. So we're not just focused on rare species in the state. We also want to make sure that we're keeping all the species that we have here around. Every state has a wildlife action plan, as well as territories and many federally recognized tribes. And their plans for conservation of wildlife in the state more generally. So this is not DNREC's Wildlife Action Plan. This is Delaware's Wildlife Action Plan. And this is a plan that hopefully can be used by anybody, whether it be the public, NGOs, partners who are looking to know what they can do for Delaware's wildlife. The nice thing is that these plans also qualify states for matching funds from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Federal State Wildlife Grants Program to support the conservation of species of greatest conservation need. So these are annually appropriated funds from Congress that we hope are going to stick around. And all of these plans need to be reviewed and revised every 10 years. So that's what we're doing right now. All of these wildlife action plans, in order to be approved by the Fish and Wildlife Service, need to have 8 required elements. They need to talk about the distribution and abundance of species of greatest conservation need in the state. They need to talk about the locations and relative condition of habitat types, potential problems, which we call issues or threats to species of greatest conservation need and their habitats, proposed conservation actions, so what we can do about them, how we're planning on monitoring the status of our SGCN, how we're going to review the plan, how we're going to work with the public and our partners in order to revise the plan, and how we're going to develop and implement the revision. So we're now working on the revision of which will be the 3rd Wildlife Action Plan. The first iteration was drafted in 2005 and approved in 2007. So I can only imagine what kind of a process that was for 2 years, but I wasn't here. The 2015 plan was primarily coordinated by a consulting group called Terwilliger Consulting and Partners. And we're currently working on our next 10-year revision, and the Division of Fish and Wildlife is leading it. Today, I'm mostly going to be talking about our species of greatest conservation need, habits, threats, actions, and our monitoring plans. So species of greatest conservation need, as I've already said many times, as I'll keep saying it, I'll probably say SGCN more because that's a little bit easier. They're the foundation of our wildlife action plans because all of our elements of these plans link back to these species. We identify the habitats species occur in, we identify threats to species and actions we can take to conserve or protect species. And even when identifying threats and actions for habitats, they're still linked back to the species because threats to habitat are threats to species. So every state gets to determine their species of greatest conservation need. They just have to say how they got to the decision of which species are designated. Broadly, we work with the Northeast region, which is 13 other states, to make sure our plans are all consistent. So we're using similar language and similar criteria across states. And so we've all agreed that the definition of a species of greatest conservation need is a native species with declining populations or vulnerabilities that will benefit from strategic conservation. That said, in Delaware, we use a lot of different information to determine what species are SGCN. We use state and federal listing status under whether they're threatened or endangered species. We use a rarity status called subnational ranks, which is decided by the biologists or the heritage programs in states. We'll use taxonomic specific plans, such as the state of the birds or partners in flight for birds. That determines specific species that might be at threat. And then we also use the expert consensus of taxonomic experts. In Delaware, we also break them down into tier 1, 2, and 3 species, where tier 1 are species requiring the most conservation, and tier 3, while still requiring conservation and protection, are at less threatened. So the habitat element, again, is just where we determine the locations and relative conditions of key habitats and community types essential to these SGCN. We link habitats to threats, action, and SGCN. And for Delaware, these are primarily based on the Guide to Delaware Vegetation Communities and Land Covers. In our plan, we have over 50 different habitat types designated, some are which further designated as key wildlife habitats or habitats of conservation concern. And so as we see these things promulgate through the plan, for example, one of our habitats in the plan is tidal salt marsh and shrubland. In that habitat, we have 56 different species designated, such as salt marsh sparrow, diamondback terrapin, forest vine stickleback, and seaside dragonlet. And threats to the habitat include sea level rise, invasive plants, and residential development, and more. So you can kind of see how all of these things are tying together within the plan. So threats and actions are definitely linked together. So the threats are the potential problems for SGCN and their habitats. And we can also designate factors which may assist restoration or conservation, but Delaware hasn't tended to do that. And then we define the proposed conservation actions and implementation priorities. So not all SGCN or habitats in our plan actually have threats or action linked to them. And often we're linking threats and actions to species groups as opposed to specific species. Because in the 2015 plan, we had almost 700 SGCN. So rather than linking threats and actions to individual species, we were linking them to things like migratory shorebirds or fireflies and things like that. So we could more generalize the plan. So that's essentially what wildlife action plans are, but they're a lot more than that because we have to use them in practice. So for most of the talk, I'm going to be going over some of the work that the Delaware Division of Fish and Wildlife does to benefit our SGCN and how that links directly back to the Wildlife Action Plan. One of the main things we do is conduct research and surveys. And so this is an issue guided by the lack of information that we have on many of our states' SGCN. We're a small state. We don't have a ton of people out there looking for species and counting them. So the threat is essentially a need for better information on population status trends and resource needs. And the action is then monitor extant species of greatest conservation need occurrences to determine population statuses and trends. So in this picture, you can see one of our biological technicians collecting data on a small turtle. And just like this, we have monitoring programs for many SGCN in Delaware. And then these research and surveys also link back to element 5 of the Wildlife Action Plan, which is monitoring plans. So we can essentially say, look, we're monitoring bog turtles, we're monitoring box turtles through this program. So I'm going to walk through some of our specific research surveys now. So here we are in the DuPont Nature Center. One of the big things that happens right outside is the research by the Delaware Shorebird Project. Some of you may have been here in January when Kat Christie, our coastal waterbird biologist, was talking about this program, one of our longest running monitoring programs in the state. And although there are a number of threats and actions in the plan tied directly to migratory shorebirds, here I pulled out the threat of habitat loss specifically, where the action is then to identify and protect important foraging, roosting, and staging areas for these birds. So as biologists and volunteers are out across the shoreline of Delaware in May and into June, they're counting shorebirds, which is great. We're understanding population trends. But understanding where the birds are and how that changes annually can help us understand where we need to do more habitat work. Do we need to put more sand out here in Mespillian, or do we need to do something else somewhere else? And these data that are being collected are critical to that. So here you can see one of our beautiful sanderling. And so this would apply to many of our SGCNs, such as sanderling, red knot, ruddy turnstone, semi-palmated sandpiper, and more. Another program that the Division of Fish and Wildlife staff do annually is barking tree frog surveys. So barking tree frogs are state endangered in Delaware, and so this is a high priority for our herpetology program to understand their population trends. So the threat again here is a need for better information on population status, trends, and habitat resource and needs. And so we monitor these extant occurrences to determine population status and trends, monitoring the status of the condition of habitats. So to do this, biologists go out at night to forested ponds and they look and listen for frogs. When they find them, they catch them, and they're marking individuals with visual implant tags with unique alphanumeric codes. So I believe these are actually, like, you can see them under blue light. Is that right? And so that in future years, when they go out and catch frogs again, they can tell which ones they caught in previous years. And so they can understand survival rates. They can, collecting ratios of marked to unmarked individuals can also help you estimate population size, reproductive output, immigration, emigration, and essentially overall give us better information on this population of this species. Another group of species that are a target of research and surveys in Delaware are fireflies. So the threat that links these species to the Wildlife Action Plan is the lack of a complete baseline inventory. And the action is to complete a baseline inventory of Delaware limb day, which is fireflies. So what our biologists do is they go out and survey in interdunal swales and salt marshes and other relevant habitat types at night when fireflies are flashing and flying around. And they can count them and also collect them if they need to identify them to species, although I believe they can mostly do that by their flashing patterns. And so this is really critical because in October of last year, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service proposed listing the Bethany Beach firefly, pictured here, as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And this species previously was thought to only occur in Delaware. It's been found in some surrounding states, but is still very rare. And their habitat types are also very rare and at risk. And so, in addition to fireflies, our state's invertebrate biologist also surveys for bees, hoverflies, and other species of greatest conservation need in the plan. So similar to birds and fireflies, there's a need for better information on reptiles and amphibians, colloquially known as herps. And in the 2015 Wildlife Action Plan, there's a specific action called out to prepare a herpetofauna atlas. So what did our herpetologist do? He organized a herp atlas. So in 2018, they started a herp atlas, which was a combined effort between biologists and citizen scientists to document the statewide distribution of reptiles and amphibians. The effort concluded in 2023, and this is a little bit of an outdated map, but as you can see, we now have an idea of the species density across the state of reptiles and amphibians. So in this image, yellow squares indicate there was more species of herps found, and blue squares where there was fewer species of herps found. And this is also great because all of these data are available online. So you can go to herpatlas.org or specifically delaware-us.herpatlas.org, and you can see these data. They are primarily on public lands because Delaware has pretty strict private access lands, or DNREC does. But this is great information for us now to know where we need to focus the conservation of the habitats that are critical for these species. Now we do more than just go out there and count critters. We're actively managing habitats for wildlife and moving animals around, potentially from areas of high density to low density. So as you can see here, this is a picture of a Delmarva fox squirrel coming out of one of the nesting boxes that we put out for them. And I'll talk a little bit more about that project in a second. But we're also modifying and enhancing habitats where feasible. So this is a modified wetland. So we did habitat modifications to the wetland to improve that, but you can also see in the background is a wood duck box. So we're putting those out there to provide nesting habitat for wood ducks. So the idea of some of these translocation projects is to move animals from areas where they are plentiful to areas where they may have been historically present or that we know suitable habitat exists for them. So although this isn't the only threat to Delmarva fox squirrels, the one I specifically pulled out is the concern about residential development causing forest habitat conversion. And the action specifically laid out in the Wildlife Action Plan was to translocate fox squirrels into suitable habitats to maintain population viability. Delmarva fox squirrels are a subspecies of fox squirrel that was previously listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act, but was removed because of recovery across much of their range, such as in Maryland and Virginia on the Delmarva. But they have not recovered in Delaware like they have in Maryland or Virginia. However, we do have what we believe to be suitable protected habitat for them in the state. So since 2020, our biologists have been translocating squirrels from Maryland to 3 sites in Delaware. So you can see in the fuchsia circle is Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, where they were trapping squirrels. And then they brought them to Assawoman Wildlife Area, Redden State Forest, and Trap Pond State Park in the red circles. And they've translocated over 123 squirrels since 2020. So as you can imagine, this is a huge effort. And then those sites are placed such that they're close to already existing fox squirrel populations at Prime Hook and Nanticoke Wildlife Area. And one of the ways that you can tell that these translocation projects are successful is because we're seeing indications of reproduction in individuals. So they have camera traps all over these sites, and they've both documented young fox squirrels and lactating females. So that indicates there's baby fox squirrels out there, which means we're successful, hopefully. And we're continuing to monitor these translocated populations and are optimistic about the future. And so here you can see our team working up some of the fox squirrels and just one of their cute little faces. Bog turtle, which is another state and federally listed species, is threatened also by habitat loss and fragmentation, a common trend. One of the actions identified in the plan for bog turtles was to reintroduce bog turtles into areas from which they had been extirpated and removed if it was determined that it was advisable, where the surrounding area is protected from development. You can see some of these actions are pretty detailed, but that helps us figure out exactly what we need to do. So to combat this threat, Delaware Fish and Wildlife staff have started working with the Brandywine Zoo to address this issue. Staff go out into the field and collect bog turtle eggs, which are then hatched and raised at the Brandywine Zoo until they're sufficient size to be released. So in this picture, you can see some of the bog turtles at the zoo. And here's the little guy who's out in the wild. So we expect some to be released this year. It's something to do with how big they get, but some might take a little bit longer to grow and maybe be released next year. So they're holding them in captivity for as long as it takes for them to get to adequate size. The Delaware Kestrel Partnership, similar to the Delaware Shorebird Project, is another one of our volunteer-based programs. This project is linked to the threat of human activity causing disturbance of nesting and foraging areas, among other things. And the action here was to establish partnerships with government agencies, conservation organizations, businesses, and private landowners to protect extant species occurrences, occupied habitats, and unoccupied suitable habitats. So for the Delaware Kestrel Partnership, the main action we're doing is putting up these kestrel boxes. So our biologists go out and they identify potentially suitable habitat. They put up these kestrel boxes and hope that a kestrel will find the box and nest in it. We have an excellent team of volunteers that help with monitoring these boxes. This year, the team will be monitoring 81 boxes throughout the state, 6 of which were added last year. We've consistently had about 6 or 7 of those boxes active. So we'd love that to be more, but it's still also a research project. So we're trying to understand what it is these kestrels actually want. In 2024, those boxes fledged 9 chicks. Although we have had some great years such as in 2021, where they fledged 24 chicks. So we're definitely adding kestrels out there into the world. There's some kestrel chicks. And if they're not being used by kestrels, some of these boxes can be used by a number of other species, such as wood ducks. Unfortunately, sometimes they're also used by European starlings, but you take what you can get. Active habitat management has also been done for the state and federally threatened piping plover. One of the threats in the 2015 Wildlife Action Plan was actually beach replenishment causing beach habitat degradation. And the action identified for that was to research the effects of beach replenishment projects on beach nesting birds, including the piping plover. It's very specific. After Hurricane Sandy, the Prime Hook Restoration Project, the Prime Hook National Wildlife Refuge Marsh Restoration Project ended up actually creating piping plover habitat by some of this beach replenishment. So you can see this was Prime Hook before the restoration project, and this was Prime Hook after, so Fowler Beach. And the plovers loved this. So in 2016, they got their first nest out at Fowler Beach, and DNREC has been partnering with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to monitor this population since then, where they've reached the high of 22 pairs, which is way more than Delaware's ever had, and as long as we've known. The plovers loved it. And then we're also partnering with the refuge to ban piping plovers, so that we can understand how piping plover broods are using this novel habitat type. I would love to create piping plover habitat up and down the Delaware Bay shore. And so this would be important to know what it actually is in terms of elevation, slope, things like that. They're also doing a lot of active management out there at Prime Hook to make sure that the habitat stays suitable for plovers. So that means a lot of vegetation removal, creating corridors for the chicks from the backshore to the intertidal zone and things like that. Interestingly, in doing a deep dive into some of these actions, one of the actions was to research how to safely mark piping plovers. So we don't have to put that in the 2025 plan because we're doing it. So go us. Finally, another active wildlife management project being done by the Division of Fish and Wildlife staff is the great work being done with northern bobwhite. So one of the threats here that was identified in the plan was residential development causing early successional habitat conversion. Bobwhite quail are early successional habitat specialists. And the action was to implement and habitat management for grassland birds. So examples of this would be planting warm season grasses, prescribed burning on state lands, focusing on extant and historic occurrences, and then determining the efficacy of these different management practices. So since 2009 at Cedar Swamp Wildlife Area, we have converted, restored, or enhanced over 1,500 acres of important and valuable upland wildlife habitat. We do this by planting and maintaining native forbs and grasses for nesting habitat, as well as for insect breeding habitat, which is good bobwhite quail food. And quail habitat also benefits other species such as songbirds and rabbits. And they're doing prescribed burning out there to maintain habitat heterogeneity, and create bare ground for the understory movement of quail and their chicks. So this work is sustaining and growing Delaware's northern bobwhite population and has resulted in one of the densest quail populations in the mid-Atlantic region. So that is some of the things that the Division of Fish and Wildlife does. By no means is it all of the things that we do, but it's sort of just a snapshot into how we're using the plan. Yeah.
I support two organizations in the state that are actually acquiring habitat. Delaware Wildlands and Nature Conservancy. The data that you file, you share that with those organizations that could step in and buy key parcels of habitat to enhance your program for the state, as well as in doing the restoring of ground you already own. But this could be more habitat by ground you don't own.
Absolutely. We do work really closely with both Delaware Wildlands and TNC, but I think that there's always space for improvement there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. So now I'm going to briefly talk about the process we are in the midst of, which is revising our wildlife action plan. So back in 2023 is when we started this revision process. From April to December of 2023, we engaged taxa teams to revise the SGCN list. So we're working with some very specific groups. We're working with a bird group, an invertebrate group, a mollusk group, a fish group, a herp group, and there's 7 of them. And they had to listen to me try to pronounce scientific names of all of these species for hours and hours at a time, where we talked about what the status of all these species was, what we think our ranks of them should be in the state. And we're hoping that that list is going to go up on DNREC's website in the next couple of weeks for the public to review. We're now currently working with the same taxa teams to revise the threats and the actions. So as I said, there's some of these threats and actions that I think we can remove. There's some of them that are probably out of date. And so we'll take those out. But then we've learned a lot in the last 10 years, right? So we're trying to identify what the new threats and actions are to all of these species. One of the big changes for 2025 is that we're adding plants as SGCN. So this is going to bring us to over 1,000 species of SGCN for the 2025 plan, because we're adding over 300 species of plants. We have a excellent botanist. And what's great is that most states, unless they completed a revision off cycle, have a comprehensive review and revision due October 1st of this year. So we're all working together to try and forward this process. Another new thing for 2025 is that we're web enabling this plan. So it's not going to be a PDF on the website that you can download and read before you go to bed at night. We're working with DJ Case and Associates, and we're going to make this plan interactive. We're going to have interactive mapping capabilities, so you can look at where habitats are in the state, zoom in and out compared to where you are. And then we're also going to have the database there for the public to see, as opposed to living in an Access database on my computer. So our hope is that the public or our partners can go in and see exactly what we've identified as threats and actions for SGCN without calling me and saying, hey, Sam, can you identify what the threats are to bobcats in Delaware? And say, well, the threat is that there's not bobcats in Delaware, so we should probably get some. Because our 2015 plan was so comprehensive, we are considering the 2025 revision as relatively minor. The 2015 plan is hundreds of pages long, especially when you consider the appendices. So we're also hoping to make it a bit more digestible. Our hope is to have the full plan available for public and partner comment in late summer of this year. And we'll be having at least one in-person and one virtual listening session for people to provide feedback or ask questions. And it's due to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in October of 2025. So I have a lot to do between now and then. So how can you be involved? One of the things is keep an eye out for some of these public comment periods. Like I said, our SGCN list is going up any day. You can go to de.gov/DWAP, and that's a short link to our website. You can come and attend our public listening sessions, so I don't have to sit there in a room with Anthony all by myself. And then you can reach out. I've put my email address here, but as of 30 minutes ago, I learned that we also have an email address that's going to be associated with this revision process. So it's going to be dwap2025@delaware.gov. Not to be confused with EWOC, which sounds similar. So with that, as I said, that's only a fragment of what the Delaware Action Plan is and what our staff does. I will also say I absolutely welcome your questions, but I'm not an expert in every species that I talked about today. I myself have a background in birds, but I'm the lady behind the database, and I have learned a lot through this process, so I'm hoping I can answer your questions about specific projects, and if not, I can at least tell you who to reach out for. And sorry, I'm a little short, but good.
It sounds like we do have a lot to do. Are you at all involved in monitoring of infectious diseases and how they affect our wildlife? Or is that a whole, probably another group that might be?
The only thing that I know of that we're specifically monitoring is highly pathogenic avian influenza, and even that we're working with USDA to do. But it's very possible that some of the other species groups are monitoring that for different things specifically. I wouldn't say we're like monitoring the water or anything like that. That would be the Division of Water or other groups, but it is very important.
Well, I mean, it's good to see that eagles and osprey have been taken off of the list after many years.
They're not even SGCN anymore.
Right. But, you know, it's through monitoring and detection that they cover what.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm one background infection.
Oh.
I'm animals too.
I absolutely agree. I mean, there was it was probably 3 or 4 years ago now, but a bunch of like blackbirds and things were dying in the state, and we collected as many as we could and sent them off, and we still don't know what caused it. So there is still so much of a gap in our knowledge there, and I'm sure that that's a threat and an action that is and will continue to be in the plan.
I think insects are the thing. I mean, that they affect vegetation more than animals.
Yeah, that's definitely called out specifically in the plan as a threat. So like on the threat slide, I had a picture of the emerald ash borer. So, you know,
'Cause I know we have them as large.
yes.
I mean, last summer, it's like, whoa, all of a sudden.
I was just remarking to Anthony the other day, I was revising the text in the threat section, and we had a whole section in 2015 on emerging potential future issues, and 3 of them were insects, and I had to add 2 of them to current issues. And spotted lanternfly wasn't in there at all.
I had one that was bold enough to even land on me one day.
You see how quick they move? You try to,
Yeah.
yeah, they are
One
gone.
of the young ones too, they're like black and with white spots, and you can't catch those. Yeah.
A question.
Sure.
I have a buddy who's has access to a vernal pond, very productive, on private property. He has reported barking creatures, normal salamanders,
Mhm.
tiger salamanders. He just go on your website to report the location of these particular amphibians and reptiles.
He could do that on Herb Mapper. Absolutely.
Okay.
He could also contact our state herpetologist, because I'm sure Nate, no, that's Nate Nastrovich.
Can you spell it?
No. But Anthony will write it down. I could write it down. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. We've had questions about infectious diseases and what someone should do if they have a vernal pool in their yard and want to report those to the state.
I have a question here. For people, you mentioned a few of these different types of habitat restoration efforts do take place on people's private lands. If someone does have, a good amount of private land, they're interested in seeing it suitable for these restoration efforts, are you the person to reach out to concerning it for groups like this? Or are there specific, I guess, how would they go about reaching out to identify this is possible within the private land?
Yeah, so Patrick asked about what private landowners should do if they think they have habitat suitable for restoration. Most of the work we do now is on state lands. We used to have a private landowner assistance program, but I don't believe that's active right now. What they could do is reach out to the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they have lots of programs that they can engage private landowners in. If they're looking to donate lands as a conservation easement or something like that, then they could contact, not me, but they could contact the Division of Fish and Wildlife generally, and they could speak with like our lands acquisition specialist or someone in our wildlife section. Yeah. And I would say too that just because the plans are due for a comprehensive review and revision every 10 years, our hope with making this plan web-enabled is that if emerging things do come up, species are identified or found in the state. I know our state's invertebrate biologist, since we did the SGCN list in 2023, has already discovered more species of bees. So we're hoping to get those on the list before the wildlife action plan is due. But with this wet database being online, we can do a minor revision anytime we need to and add species that maybe are newly discovered or threats that are newly determined in the state. So this can hopefully be a more recurring process as opposed to a huge lift every 10 years.
Have one question in the chat. Have any programs lost funding due to federal things going on?
Yeah, that's a good question. And as far as I know, none of the wildlife programs have lost funding as of yet, and we haven't heard any threats of that or concerns of that. So our fingers are crossed. As I said, the state wildlife grant program is annually appropriated by Congress, and it's been pretty consistent over the last 10 or 15 years how much the states get every year. We also do a lot of this work under Pittman-Robertson funds. So those are funds that are come through the state through taxes on ammunition, and those have been doing very well because we have our own state duck stamps. So some of those funds do come to the state, and some of them we give to partners as well. So those funds have actually been Pittman-Robertson has been doing better in recent years. And so we're just hoping things at least remain consistent, if not improve.